Welcome back, everyone. Our last session is starting now. It's entitled Strategic, Operational and Organizational Implications for NATO. And I'm so excited that it will be moderated by Dr. Melissa Griffith. She's a Senior Program Associate at Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. She's non-resident research fellow at the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity and adjunct professor at Georgetown Center for Security Studies. Welcome, Melissa. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It is my pleasure here today, albeit virtually, to moderate this session on the strategic, operational, and organizational implications for NATO. We are very lucky to be joined by 3 panelists, each of whom brings significant expertise and insight to the topic at hand. We're joined here, again, virtually, by Dr. Samantha Ravich. Samantha is the chairman of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation and its Transformative Cyber Innovation Lab. We are also joined by Ms. Chelsey Slack. Chelsey is the deputy head of the cyber defense section with the international staff at NATO Headquarters in Brussels. And last but not least, we are joined by Mr. John Gwinnup. He is a cyber threat intelligence analyst with NATO's Intelligence Fusion. The goal of this entire workshop that you have sat through today has been to look ahead at the year 2030. First, to understand the environment NATO is likely to face going forward, and second, to identify opportunities and challenges for NATO given that environment. As the final session of today's workshop, we're now focusing our collective attention on the strategic, operational, and organizational implications of that current and future dynamics of cyberspace for this alliance. So for this session, we are focusing on NATO. NATO is front and center, and the dynamics of cyberspace are taking a slight step back. To that end, this session will touch on topics ranging from intelligence collections and the challenges associated there with member states really holding much of that capability, to NATO's new comprehensive cyber defense policy and the foundation that lays for 2030, to the view from one of the member states, the United States, specifically looking at the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, the 2021 NDAA, which is in full swing, and other legislative lines of efforts, and what those will mean, these kind of member state policies for NATO going forward. As a quick logistical note, this session is slated for about an hour. We'll begin with 7 to 10 minutes opening remarks from each of the panelists. After they offer that wisdom up to us, we'll transition to about 30 minutes of open moderated Q&A. This is a workshop, and though I know for many of you this is the end of a workshop, we're slated in that session 3 spot. We do want this to be as interactive as possible. So please, as your questions pop up, raise your hand in the kind of virtual environment here. You can drop that question in the chat and I will pull it up here on Microsoft Teams. Or if you are luckily in Tallinn and you're enjoying the environment there, you can raise your hand and kind of aggressively wave so that I can see you. You're very tiny on the screen there. But please do bring your questions and I will do my best to weave them throughout the discussion. So without further ado, I would like to hand the virtual mic off to our first panelist for their opening remarks. Samantha, please take it away.
Thank you. And thank you all for having me. I wish I were there physically, as I'm sure we all do. As Melissa said, I'm honored to serve as a commissioner on the Congressional Cyberspace Solarium Commission, alongside of 4 sitting members of Congress and 5 outsiders, although now we're only 4 outsiders because, as many of you know, Chris Inglis has gone on to the White House to become the first ever national cyber director, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But, you know, I think it's always good to look back before we look ahead, and to know what's been tried before, what's worked, what's failed. The whole Cyberspace Solarium Commission was created with a nod to the earlier Solarium exercise by President Eisenhower that created a way for the U.S. and its allies to confront the growing threat of the Soviet Union. We are now most of the way through our 2nd year in the commission, and at the conclusion of our first, we issued a major report with legislative recommendations. So I'm going to go over some of those and then talk a little bit about what we're looking forward to having new legislation on the books. In that report, which, oh, by the way, came out 3 days before lockdown in March of 2020, we advocated for a new strategic approach to cybersecurity, which we called layered cyber deterrence, to reduce the probability of and the impact from cyber attacks of significant consequences. And the strategy that we outlined to achieve this end rested on 3 pillars. 1, shape behavior, which the United States must work with allies and partners to promote responsible behavior in cyberspace. 2, deny benefits. The United States must deny benefits to adversaries who have long exploited cyberspace to their advantage and at little cost to themselves. And this new approach really requires securing critical networks in collaboration with the private sector, but let me add again, allies and partners as well, to promote national resilience and increase the security of the cyber ecosystem. And 3rd, impose costs. The United States must maintain the capacity, capability, and credibility needed to retaliate against actors who target America in and through cyberspace. So it should be clear to all that such an imposition of costs will be made more difficult, if not impossible, if we don't do it in cooperation and collaboration with our allies and partners. So we were incredibly successful in getting 25 of our recommendations into the 2021 National Defense Authorization Act, meaning they became the law of the land. Some of these key pieces of legislation included the creation of the Office of the National Cyber Director, which Chris Inglis now heads, which in addition to its other functions has responsibility for reviewing agencies' cyber budgets and evaluating their spending decisions. So as we like to say, follow the money if you want to know where people's priorities are. Another key piece of legislation was for a planning process for the creation of a continuity of the economy plan to ensure the rapid restart and recovery of the U.S. economy after a major disruption. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment as well. We got laws passed to strengthen the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, in DHS in several ways, including the creation of a joint cyber planning office. So all of these things, as you're going to hear through my comments, wind into what most cooperate with. There's lots of those places, but CISA certainly is something that is getting more beefed up, more resources, and one of our pieces of legislation giving CISA the authority to threat hunt on federal networks. We codified sector risk management agencies and law, establishing minimum responsibilities and requirements for identifying, assessing, and assisting in managing risk for critical infrastructure. We advanced military and Department of Defense efforts to secure the nation in cyberspace through a force structure assessment of the cyber mission force, clarifying the cyber capabilities and interoperability of the National Guard, and an assessment of the potential for a cyber reserve force. We on the Commission didn't think that, we thought that a review of the cyber mission force was absolutely critical if we were going to do that 3rd plank in deterrence, which means impose costs, and important strides in how to protect the defense industrial base. So our work wasn't done, though, after year 1, and so we continued to meet. In fact, we just had our 46th 2-hour meeting. 3 out of 4 members of Congress participate in every single one of those meetings. It's really a phenomenal exercise, and we have several key proposals that the Commission is focusing on for this coming legislative cycle. One is protecting systemically important critical infrastructure. It calls for the Secretary of Homeland Security to designate our most critical infrastructure. The creation of a cyber threat information collaboration environment. It's also known as the Joint Collaborative Environment. It would be in the U.S. government the focal point for sharing and fusing of all federal and critical infrastructure cyber threat information. Establishing a Bureau of Cyber Statistics. That bureau would drive insights into what does and does not work when it comes to mitigating cyber risk. And the creation, and this is very important for the topic at hand, of the Bureau of International Cyberspace Policy at the U.S. Department of State via the Cyber Diplomacy Act. And the creation of that bureau is dedicated to cyberspace policy. It ensures that the State Department has the cross-cutting authorities and resources needed to participate and lead in many organizations that shape cyberspace, while also expanding the U.S.'s diplomatic ground game. So from the very start of the commission, we recognize that in this interconnected world, we really are only as safe as the weakest link. Many of our recommendations for actions are not only meant for the U.S., the government, the private sector, the citizen, but also meant to help build a stronger international community and incentivize and assist countries to better protect the critical and the digital networks that we all live on. But we also know that it would be naive to believe that all countries in the world have either the desire or the willingness to be responsible actors in this domain. And our recommendations, therefore, are built on the premise that there are no sidelines in this new battle space. And countries will need to decide if they wish to help build the better, safer future, take the required actions, or be left out of the mutual protections that are afforded to those who participate. So a community of committed and technically capable international partners can add valuable perspective and information about how malign activities are carried out and may be able to provide lawful access to systems, to targets, and information beyond any one country's borders. Different international partners are going to contribute a variety of capabilities and resources within this collaborative system in order to balance the benefits of international support with the need to act quickly. So with that in mind, that's why we crafted the Cyber Diplomacy Act, particularly the creation of the Bureau of International Cyberspace Policy. It'll be critical in upholding our essential relationship with NATO. Because as the Brussels communique at the NATO summit made clear, we're in a world where we need to think through how to realize when and where needed such things as a collective response to malicious cyber behavior, how it actually occurs. The force structure assessment of our cyber mission force will also be important in that context in NATO, particularly in terms of how it informs the capabilities needed and necessary to continue to expand hunt forward operations conducted in partnership with allies, such as the recent collaboration between cyber that I just want to mention. And again, it's important to give a nod to the past and where we can learn from it. When I was preparing for today, I took a look back at the first ever planning exercise in NATO that occurred in 1956. And it was a report on how to enhance non-military cooperation and coordination within NATO. And it was entitled The Report of the Three Wise Men. For many reasons, that title wouldn't fly today, but the substance of that report is really relevant for today's challenges and dovetails well with my remarks about Solarium, because those three wise men identified an urgent need to enhance the quality and availability of qualified scientists, engineers, and technicians. The fear was that within NATO, we were falling behind Russia in technology, and the very basis of the economy and the military might of the West was at risk. And they noted that, quote, Soviet leaders have invested substantial resources in a rapid development of their educational system to ensure the recruitment of a long-term basis of scientists, technicians, and specialists. And progress on our side is so crucial to the future of the Atlantic community that NATO members should ensure that every possibility of fruitful cooperation is examined. And so in Solarium, we took those words to heart. So we also have made a number of new and augmented recommendations about workforce issues. So I just want to wrap up my comments by bringing it all back to what does Solarium mean for the future of NATO cooperation? I think there are three things. The first is, I think NATO's cyber planning structures and the cyber, frankly, planning structures of individual NATO countries can learn a lot from the Solarium process by conducting hundreds of interviews and dozens of red teaming efforts and really debating about the trade-offs in cybersecurity, privacy versus security, for instance. We built legislative recommendations that focused on the key priorities while recognizing our limitations. The second is our entire way of life, as now constructed at least, is at risk. Our economic, political, military, and societal framework are under assault. And those networks are under assault not by an unthinking virus, but by hostile human states and non-state actors. And no country can stand on the sideline. Adversaries must be called out by name and with every tool available be deterred. We as NATO members must need to be, as we say in the US, all on the same page on this. And finally, it is more than likely that a major attack will take place. The lights will go out at the same time the banking system is disrupted, at the same time communication channels are shut down. And Solarium's recommendation on a continuity of the economy planning process would be a tremendous step forward in giving us the resiliency needed to thwart such an attack and recover if it did happen. And such planning is not easy. It requires mapping the economy, ensuring safe data repositories exist, and putting into place a well-understood order of recovery plan. So I would urge all of you to take a look at this piece of legislation in the 2021 NDAA and to think about creating something similar within your own country and for NATO writ large. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Samantha. I really appreciate you took us on a really great, I think, exploration of the Cyber Solarium Commission report and the process and some of the poor timing that happened there around the pandemic, but the amazing amount of work that you all have done there, and really pointed us toward this diplomacy front and center in that process and the need to really dig into some of these trade-offs moving forward. And then also took us back to the days of the three wise men. Now that we've sort of seen the view from the United States, the implications of what that is for NATO and some of the lessons we may be able to kind of import into the NATO architecture, but also for NATO states, let's pivot now to Chelsey for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Melissa. And I'd really like to thank colleagues at ACT as well as the Center of Excellence for having me as part of this panel. It's really a pleasure to contribute to such a timely discussion. And I know it's been a long day, so thank you for being with us. As one French writer once said about the future, your task is not to foresee it, but it's to enable it. And I think that's precisely what today's discussions are meant to do, to not only try to understand what this future might look like, but also how to be prepared for it. Now, as part of my remarks, as Melissa said, I'd like to recall some of the recent developments that have been going on at this NATO headquarters in terms of our thinking about NATO and its approach to cyber defense. Allied heads of state and government endorsed at their summit in June a new comprehensive cyber defense policy for NATO. And prior to developing and negotiating this policy with allies, we undertook a review to reflect on how our approach has evolved since allies first recognized in 2014 that a cyber attack could be grounds to invoke Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. So cyber defense integrated into NATO's core task of collective defense. Now, indeed, we've been on a journey for the past 2 decades, and that's what we had to look at. Really, once viewing this issue from a purely technical perspective, with the standing up of NATO's first capabilities in 2002, to now seeing cyber defense as part and parcel of NATO's broader approach to deterrence and defense now in 2021. A particular focus of this policy review was very much to re-examine the strategic environment in which we find ourselves. And namely, where can we draw parallels from some of the other more conventional domains, air, land, and sea? But perhaps most critically, and I think the first and second panels probably touched on this quite extensively, really, how is cyber as a domain different from the other domains? And how does that then necessitate the way that we reconceptualize cyberspace and the characteristics of it as it's been developing over the last few years? So I'd like to highlight then in the next few minutes some of the main elements, main reflections that underpin NATO's new comprehensive cyber defense policy. And then I'll turn to looking ahead to 2030 and what can be expected in this regard. So turning then to the strategic context that underpins the new policy, and once again, I'm sure I'm echoing points from previous discussions, but we had quite a debate on this as well. So it really was at the forefront of then how we conceptualized how to take NATO's approach moving forward. But really the importance of seeing cyberspace for what it is. And this often challenges our thinking, as I said, as we seek familiarity with the other more conventional domains, but then also understanding the importance of cyberspace in and of itself. It's contested at all times, threat actors increasingly seeking to destabilize the alliance by employing malicious cyber activities and campaigns below the threshold of an armed attack, which means we need to be ready and comfortable with using all the tools in the toolbox that we have, which spans not only the military sphere, but also the diplomatic, political, and in the case of allies, economic. We're also not concerned only with the physical risk, for example, malicious cyber activities targeting critical infrastructures, but also increasingly the cyber-enabled threats, so the cognitive dimension, including through, for example, disinformation. And compounding this complexity of the intermixing between the physical and the virtual is, of course, the emerging work on destructive technologies. So NATO has been doing quite a lot of thinking on the policy side in this area in recent months, and the integration of that with the more traditional cyber aspects is very much of interest. So with the above in mind, 7 years after the adoption of NATO's last policy in 2014, with key decisions being taken in the meantime, like the adoption of the Cyber Defense Pledge in 2016 or the recognition of cyberspace as a domain of operations in 2016, it was time to reflect more comprehensively in a new policy some of the strategic implications that characterize cyberspace. And so in developing this policy, we really looked across a broad range of NATO's activities in this area, everything from capability development to information sharing, from the tools at NATO's disposal for imposing costs on actors who wish to do allies harm, but also in how we engage with partners in broader global discussions around cyber stability. This work was informed, of course, by the strategic discussions both in political and military spheres. And here I'm referring both to the NATO 2030 agenda, but also the discussions on the NATO warfighting capstone concept and related military doctrine. And of particular relevance is the notion of proactively shaping the security environment while contesting competitors' attempts to undermine NATO's objectives. So what then does the 2021 NATO policy do, and most interestingly, what's new about it? Well, the policy reaffirms existing principles, including NATO's defensive mandate, as well as the applicability of international law in cyberspace. And it is also very much anchored in NATO's broader deterrence and defense posture. And building on this foundation, there are 5 key areas that I'd like to highlight in particular. So the first is the fact that cyberspace is contested at all times. And put simply, unlike the other domains, cyberspace is a domain that is always on, and we need to be able to respond accordingly. The previous policy recognized that a cyber attack could be grounds to invoke Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. And in the view of the nature of cyberspace and the evolving threat environment, this new policy not only reaffirms that, but also looks more comprehensively at responses below the threshold of Article 5, given that it is a space that is continuously shaped and contested by various actors. The second element is that to do this requires really a proactive and comprehensive approach. And this is a unity of effort at the political, the military, and the technical level. So it's important to distinguish between these different levels in our policy discussions, given the different mandates, the definitions and activities of the 3 tiers of what we now call NATO's comprehensive cyber defense. So the political, the military, and the technical integrated together. NATO must actively deter, defend against, and counter the full spectrum of cyber threats at all times during peacetime crisis and conflict, and responses need to be continuous and draw on NATO's toolbox more broadly. The third element is around the impact that significant malicious cumulative cyber activities might, in certain circumstances, be considered as amounting to an armed attack. Put differently, this is an acknowledgement that the security implications of the exploitation of cyberspace may not only be the result of a single large-scale event, but through the accumulation of risk. Those who might want to harm us can achieve the same strategic gains below the threshold. And so the new policy addresses the fact that a series of lower impact malicious cyber activities, or a cyber campaign, by the same threat actor could be as destructive as a single high-impact cyber attack. So for instance, against critical infrastructure. And as always, this isn't changing the decision-making, because any consideration of Article 5 and the types of malicious cyber activity that could be grounds for allies to decide to invoke it would of course be taken on the basis, case-by-case basis, and through political consultation. So really what this aimed to do was look once again at the strategic environment, at the threat landscape, and seeing not only the one-off single events, but also these campaigns that could potentially achieve the same strategic effects. Fourth, NATO will play a larger role as a platform for political consultation among allies, including for sharing concerns about malicious cyber activities, as well as considering possible collective responses. And if necessary, NATO allies will impose costs on those who harm them, and such responses are not only limited to cyberspace. Through earlier initiatives, such as NATO's Guide for Strategic Response Options to Malicious Cyber Activities, we've been developing this menu of responses at the political, the diplomatic, and the military level. And really the aim here is to continue to do this and really to ramp up information intelligence sharing to support the political consultations and facilitate collective action, depending on how allies wish to respond to a specific instance. Fifth and finally, which has also been mentioned, is really the notion of resilience and the ability to detect, prevent, mitigate, and respond to vulnerabilities and intrusions. This is really critical to our broader cyber defense efforts. So looking at initiatives such as the Cyber Defense Pledge, taking that forward in terms of allied capability development, but also ensuring that NATO as an organization has strong and robust cyber defenses. And this is really still a cornerstone of NATO's approach to cyber defense writ large. The policy, coupled with this notion of resilience, also addresses then the need to leverage knowledge and also emerging disruptive technologies as part of our network defenses, but also more generally when it comes to capability development and also being able to shape the space in which we find ourselves. So in a nutshell, those are the 5 main pillars, main reflections that comprise some of the newer elements of the NATO policy, and these were also reflected in the Brussels Summit communique from June. And really the new policy aims to set the vision at the strategic level for NATO's activities in cyberspace for the coming decade towards NATO 2030. And so in the next months, what we'll be charged to do is to put these words into action and develop a plan to actually implement all the various levels at the political, military, technical level that are prescribed in the policy. So that is some of the latest thinking that is now driving action forward. And I'll conclude by talking a little bit about what does this mean moving forward and what might it look like? How is it influenced? And I think first and foremost, it is important to consider cyber defense against the backdrop of the broader political and military considerations for the alliance. I've already mentioned related military doctrines such as the capstone concept, but also when it comes to the NATO 2030 agenda, this includes enhancing NATO as a transatlantic forum for political consultations and joint action, standing up for the rules-based international order and defending our values and interests, enhancing resilience and defense, leveraging emerging and disruptive technologies, and deepening partnerships, including through capacity building activities. So cyber has an important role to play in all of these broader aspects currently under discussion as part of the broader NATO 2030, and I would also argue leading up to the development of a new strategic concept next year as well. Now, specifically as part of the new policy, allies made it clear that they will further seek to develop mutually beneficial and effective partnerships, including in other countries, as well as international organizations such as the EU, but also in industry and academia, furthering efforts to enhance broader stability in cyberspace. And they also committed to promoting a free, open, peaceful, and secure cyberspace, committing to reduce the risk of conflict by supporting international law and voluntary norms of responsible responsible state behavior. And in an early instance of the new policy in action, I draw your attention to the statement of solidarity with those affected by recent malicious cyber activities, including the Microsoft Exchange compromise. This was a statement by the North Atlantic Council, and it really spoke to the notion of what we consider unacceptable behavior in cyberspace, so calling that out. And these statements, given the fact they're also done in conjunction with other partners, other international organizations, really speaks to this notion of using NATO as a platform to enhance situational awareness and inform the development of possible response options across political, diplomatic, and military spheres. So that's really an important aim of this new policy, using NATO as this platform, and also with a view to broader global stability efforts. As I mentioned, NATO leaders will come together in Madrid next year, where they expect to agree a new strategic concept for the alliance. And looking to the future, cyber defense will, of course, continue to make its contribution to the alliance's broader deterrence and defense posture and the fulfillment of its three core tasks: collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security. And the new comprehensive cyber defense policy aims to lay the groundwork for all of those efforts into the future. And now the real challenge, of course, is to enable this future against the backdrop of global competition, but also profound technological and societal change. So this is a shared challenge that requires collective resolve, and it's clear that in this environment that's always on, so too must be our efforts to engage. So I welcome once again the opportunity to engage with you today on this topic and look forward to the discussion to follow. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you, Chelsey. I appreciate, again, mirroring that format of where have we been, where are we now, where are we going, and sort of getting that trajectory. And within the United States, as is within NATO, there's been a real evolution of how we understand this challenge and how we approach it. I think what's notable now about the first two remarks before we turn to John is the amount of synergy that we're seeing emerging in terms of the language, both in terms of domestic capabilities and sort of domestic approaches to these issues, and then also those approaches within the alliance, terms like resilience, needing to broaden that aperture around how we understand and implement deterrence, the importance of cooperation and diplomacy, the needs to approach both the private sector and international communities, balancing different interests, and having to move beyond sort of understanding these threats at a high level to implementing that in practice, which is sort of the devil in the details and those real efforts taking place. And then I think finally, we should always keep in mind your sort of plea there to keep in mind the different levels at which our policy conversation happens: the political, the diplomatic, the military, and then the technical, and that these are in some ways distinct conversations, but deeply interrelated and must be comprehensive in how we approach. I would like to now pivot to John, who will close us out for the opening statements.
Thanks, Melissa. And good day, everyone. Before I start, I'd just like to thank Brett, the CCDCOE, and a certain name-dropping friend for providing me with this opportunity to speak to all of you. As was said earlier, my name is John Gwinnup. I'm a cyber threat analyst at the NATO Intelligence Fusion Center. I'm a hired contractor who has been working with the organization for nearly 10 years. So as a contractor, the statements I make do not reflect the opinions, policies, or positions of the NIFC, the NATO Alliance, or my corporate employer. So my legal disclaimer out of the way, I'd like to talk to all of you about intelligence, specifically cyber intelligence, and how it can, is, and should be, in my opinion, used to support NATO operations. I'd like to give you my opinion on what I think cyber intelligence is, imply what it isn't, and then discuss where I think it will be in the coming years. At the end, I'll make a feeble attempt to kind of explain why all of this matters. So intelligence, with a capital I, which is not to be confused with intellect, as those two rarely overlap, is at its core an assumption supported by fact. We glam it up with analytic techniques and language meant to imply our level of certainty, but at the end of the day, it's a guess. It's an informed guess, but even a well-researched assessment is still a guess. The rub is that it's the best we've got. No one is omniscient, and we never know the whole story, so we do the best with what we've got. Obviously, cyber intelligence, with its appropriate encapsulating air quotes, is no different from any other form of intelligence, and is just as reliant on guesswork, or rigorous analysis if you want to be polite. But what exactly is cyber intelligence? If you wanted to be simple, you could say It's intelligence about or derived through the cyber domain. But what exactly does that mean in a practical sense? On one hand, you could say that cyber intelligence is the technical information used to identify, characterize, and enable a response to a malicious network incident. It's information about malware or system vulnerabilities or the tactics, techniques, and procedures used by an actor to exploit a system. And if you only had one hand, I think you would be right. But there is another hand. And in that other hand, more traditional types of intelligence are held. Things like who the actor is, who they work for, where they work, and why they do what they do. Over the years, we've gotten good at technical information side of things, so much so that identifying and mitigating network threats has become a multi-billion-dollar industry. And we've made inroads on the other type as well. Nations pointing the finger of blame and attributing cyber incidents to other nations has become relatively routine. And oftentimes, these statements of attribution include information not only on the what and the how, but also the who, where, and why of an incident. Not that the attributions are universally accepted. The accused almost always denies responsibility, but in most cases, there is at least a general consensus. Attribution on this kind of level primarily supports broad strategic efforts. It's arguably a political exercise meant to shine light on nefarious activity and hopefully motivate an actor and their state controller to operate differently. And to be sure, all of that attribution is supported by both hands of intelligence. But attribution lives in the realm of national responsibility, and as an alliance of 30 sovereign states, NATO would need collective concurrence to attribute an incident to a specific nation. This hasn't happened, at least not in a concrete way, and I'm not really certain it ever will. But national attribution of cyber incidents is not the only way cyber intelligence is useful. We know it supports incident response and recovery, and NATO is using it for that. But this is primarily uses the technical type of cyber intelligence and mostly supports the mission of organizations like the NATO Communications and Information Agency. And while NCIA is many things, it is not an intelligence with a capital I authority. And like most organizations responsible for incident response, it is rightfully not overly concerned with the who or why of a cyber incident. But there are organizations within NATO which are concerned with the who or why. Mine is amongst them, and we work hard to determine as much as we can about the actors behind cyber incidents and assess what motivates them. This supports broader military planning and operations because it is important to know who the adversary is, where they operate from, and why they do what they do. To me, this is the primary role of military intelligence, cyber or otherwise. Know the adversary so that you can predict and hopefully prevent what they will do in the future. It's not just about response and recovery from a network incident. Which brings me to where I think we're going. The inevitable step is something that I think many have talked about, some have attempted, but no one, at least from my view, seems to have a firm grasp on, which is operationalizing cyber capabilities to directly support military operations. The alliance and most of its constituent nations are only in the beginning stages of tackling this issue. Some key members have a substantial level of experience, that's for sure, but sharing that experience so that others can collectively learn from it has its own challenges. NATO is actively working on the defensive side of cyber operations equation, and intelligence plays a key role in that. But it's using cyber capabilities to support traditional military operations that is the real challenge. And just to be clear, when I say traditional military operations, what I really mean is offensive military operations. Any of those capabilities would have to be provided by a constituent nation, as NATO has and almost certainly never will have its own offensive cyber capabilities. It's unclear when or really even if NATO would ever actually employ cyber capabilities in support of such an operation. But in my opinion, it is the inevitable direction that we need to prepare for. So that kind of concludes my points. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, John. I think that's actually a very helpful kind of course corrective, and we started much broader looking at national policies, NATO level policies that are quite expansive using large term deterrence, resilience, moving across all of the different levers in terms of your diplomatic, your military, your technical opportunities. And then we kind of narrowed down on a very specific subset of that conversation on intelligence. And often when we talk about intelligence, we talk about it often in the domain itself as an intelligence contest, and less about when we are gathering large amounts of intelligence in this domain, what do we do with that as an alliance and within NATO? So I appreciate that course collective. As I'm waiting for some questions to come in on the chat, are there any questions in the physical room? I know all of us here virtually are jealous that you are all sitting in beautiful Tallinn there, but is there anyone in the room before I put up another question? A lot of looking around at each other. No questions in the room.
I'll ask you a question, if you don't mind.
Please.
For John, you mentioned briefly towards the end there offensive cyber capabilities, and we were having a bit of a discussion here during the breakout session about turning the tables, so to speak, on our adversaries. And instead of focusing so much on our own weaknesses, now our adversaries can take advantage of them. How can we identify these and utilize these amongst our adversaries? And I wondered if you wanted to think out loud a little bit more on this topic of the day that NATO will more actively use offensive cyber capabilities instead of purely acting in a defensive, or at least purely having the conversation about defensive capabilities, sort of in line with the American concept of defend forward. Any thoughts on that?
So are you essentially asking me what I would assume, what the sort of form this would take?
Well, you could muse about the trend over the next couple of years.
I think, if anything, it would start initially small. I could foresee the sort of situation where something similar to perhaps some of the operations that Cybercom has openly discussed about what it's done against ISIL actors during the height of the operations in Syria. So perhaps something against, it would have to be under the auspices of a declared operation. So, and if anything, I think it would most certainly take the form, if anything, of provided capabilities, but there could be the possibility of sort of a centralized and organized control. I will admit there's been a lot of discussion about the formalization of this, but, and I kind of tried to allude to it in my discussion, in actual practical terms, the direction this is going. I guess my short answer is I'm really reluctant to make a prediction because I'm fairly certain I'll be wrong.
Samantha, Chelsey, do you want to maybe build off that a little? I'm thinking, Samantha, you're looking at this very heavily from the U.S. perspective, and kind of when thinking about the United States incentives and what they're thinking about for cooperative action, this sort of more contesting the environment, defend forward, persistent engagement. Is that something that in the United States seems like, yes, we would like to see that happening within an alliance like NATO, that's still sort of nation state held? And then similarly, once you've spoken, Samantha, Chelsey, at the level of the kind of conversations you're already having and moving forward that strategy, is that something that's being encapsulated, moving from that kind of more defensive posture into offensive action, which is something that NATO has historically done as well?
Yeah, I mean, look, from the U.S. side, I think the kind of mindset is certainly we need to do more to impose costs, and that is that's clear and becoming clearer. And Solarium and other members of Congress are giving the executive branch the tools and authorities and the budgets to do that. When it comes to how it works in cooperation, collaboration with NATO members or other partners and allies, it's tricky, right? I mean, speaking kind of plainly, the U.S. likes the freedom of action it has to do what it needs to do. But, there is this recognition that, we're certainly the U.S. is clear it's not omniscient, it's not omnipresent, and it does, it certainly does not see everywhere that it needs to be and be able to move in the agility and speed in all cases. And, so I think there is a recognition of where partners and allied nations can assist. I think that there is an opening of the door to do more on that front. And let me just add on that, because I think this is probably worthy of a whole other session. It's not just the nation states themselves, but it's the private sector actors within those nation states, within those allied partner states, right? So, I'm part of a discussion group that's thinking within the U.S., should private sector actors be able to use letters of marque and reprisal? It's a U.S. constitutional ability for Congress to give private sector actors the ability to take offensive actions. When you think about ransomware and clawback on ransomware, should the U.S. government be looking to work hand in hand with our own private sector to do those type of actions? It's an important thought exercise to think about how that would actually roll into some type of U.S. NATO cooperation and the private sector partners within each of our countries. So there's some thoughts.
Chelsey, would you like to add there?
Yes, just to note perhaps at the strategic level, of course, this policy, comprehensive military, technical, political, but also very much reaffirms NATO's defensive mandate. So looking once again at the resilience of our systems, and as that baseline of trying to have the most robust defenses possible. That said, and as was already agreed a few years ago, the notion under operationalizing cyberspace as a domain, that broader deterrence and defense, of course, allies can provide those capabilities, including offensive, that are integrated into NATO missions and operations. So that very much, and the new policy takes a proactive approach across all of those tiers, but very much, once again, grounded in the fundamentals. So I think over the last few years, been looking at, how this would, what is required to be in place in order to enable this. How do we test this in exercises? How do allies see this at the national level? And then how, from a planning doctrine perspective, is that all brought together? So definitely more conversations to be had, but it is absolutely an area where there is a lot of priority. And I think, once again, it's highlighting this more proactive approach in terms of the different tools in the toolbox. So yes, there might be a time and a place for the military tools. That said, the political, the more diplomatic side of things when it comes to imposing costs is equally important. So hence now this comprehensive approach, proactive, but still very much grounded in that defensive mandate. I'll leave it at that.
Perfect. And we have a question from Perrette that I would like to flag and put forward. And I think it feeds into a question I had as well for all of the panelists. And Perrette is saying that, when we think about NATO and this platform, the opportunity for cooperation, there's sort of twofold goals. There's the more political consultation, ability to do collective response kind of concerns. And then there's this much more developed organizational and technical capabilities, capacity to carry out operations either offensively or to protect the networks within the alliance itself. And she is interested in whether allies, so the member states, are equally interested in both those goals, or is there far more interest in pursuing one over the other? And maybe we can do reverse order. We'll start with Chelsey.
Yes, thank you. I think when we looked at this, perhaps once again, I'll come to the word comprehensive, but I don't think it's an either or. I think it's really, we need to be able to do all of this, to be able to defend ourselves, to develop that capability, to have our own house, continue to develop, but then also to raise the level of resilience and defense across allies. So hence why areas around, the cyber defense pledge and raising that level of baseline, there are different policy tools that can be brought to bear. So I think it was looking a lot at, the different pieces, the resilience and defense dimension, but then also increasingly, how do we bring this all together and use this collective platform that we have for enhancing situational awareness, better information sharing, putting the different pieces of the puzzle together, recognizing that each of the 30 allies has its own reach back then into, as Samantha was talking about, the industry dimension and their expertise more generally. So I think it's really a case of not prioritizing one or the other. We need to be able to do all of what's asked of us in order to achieve those three core tasks of NATO. And I'm sure the discussions will continue as in the lead up to the new strategic concept, which will once again set the overarching direction, which we will then work towards moving forward.
It's a little bit turn of phrase, NATO should chew gum and walk at the same time. We can produce both of these at the same time. Let's turn to you, Samantha.
You know, right now in the U.S., we're evaluating how effective new Treasury sanctions are, and some other, so neither military might or diplomatic writings, but other types of actions. We're trying to figure out how effective are we at we're going after Russia actors and non-state actors, Chinese actors and non-state actors that have been involved in malicious activities against our networks, our banks, our government. I think the jury's out on how effective those are going to be. We're bouncing them from markets. We have together, obviously, the NATO countries. Our market power is tremendous, is significant. There's something in between, which I don't think we're that good at yet, at using the tools of our collective space and our collective market space. We're trying to figure that out in the U.S. Right? How do we impose costs on actors without having to shut down their networks and without just having to speak out and name and shame them? So I think that there's a middle ground that probably we need to think about how to use it more effectively.
Thinking through that middle ground, John, you get the final word on this question.
I'm sorry. I'm just going to have to plead ignorance and concur with the much better statements that were said before me than anything I could say. Yeah, I think Samantha and Chelsey said it much better than I could ever even attempt.
Excellent. Pleading the fifth here, pleading some ignorance. We have another question coming in. This one is for John, and I think potentially also could be expanded to the rest of the panelists as well. And here, this is about a conversation that was happening out in the breakout sessions around how do you do this in practice, and the recognition that when we talk about the network necessary, in your case, to do intelligence and operationalize that is not just government and government agencies and intelligence agencies. You're talking about private sector, particularly in cyberspace, these private intelligence actors, and then also private companies that are the platform owners, or the kind of own the infrastructure and see a lot of that capability. And so the question is really, how do you do that in practice? Kind of create that correct network, bridge these very political intelligence agencies, which have their own very different cultures of information sharing, and this private sector that has its very different culture, very different countries it's rooted in, to create the capability for NATO to do this in practice.
So just for brevity, I'll just talk about my experience within NATO. And it's perhaps not the correct answer or the best answer, but it is the correct answer. And the thing is that I have found that it's very much relationship driven. So there are systems in place, and there are tools available, and there are policies and different things like that that are supposed to enable the flow of information from, like you mentioned, the private sector, from the different agencies, from the different elements, and then all the information that is collected from NATO networks and everything contained within that. But getting all of those systems to talk to one another and getting all of those pieces to connect requires, at least from my experience, active human interaction. And unfortunately, a lot of this stuff lives and dies with the individuals who are acting as those bridges, who are acting as those threads connecting everything together. Fortunately, to some degree, I guess maybe fortunately, it's not a small community, but it's not overly large. So it's relatively easy to know who the right people are to get in contact in certain situations. But that's within the kind of the collective NATO portion of it. Once you start moving out to different national structures and things like that, it very much requires who you know and what you know about them. I know that there are consistently efforts to make sort of this more routine or more organized, or something that doesn't have to live on the back of specific human beings. To be blunt, I haven't seen a whole lot of success on that front. It's pretty much stayed very human-driven, and maybe that's just the way that works best. I don't know. Maybe that's just a quirk of us as human beings. I don't know. I hope that kind of gets to the answer to the question.
It's a good sales pitch, though, for events like this as well. The more that we can be in conversation with each other across a variety of institutions, you start to know each other and can really leverage those more informal bonds as well. I know there's always a joke. The United States has huge turnover, huge bureaucracy. If you're dealing with like an Estonia, much smaller community, if they're reaching out to some of their fellow countries around them, those communities are a little more stagnant. Sometimes in the US, I'll reach back out to someone and the person's changed from the week before and you're thinking, who is this new person? Very dense infrastructure. I want to turn to you, Samantha, also to sort of pull this question wider because I think it's really important. This public-private, maybe some lessons, it's a big buzzword, we like to say it, whole of government, whole of society, public-private partnerships. Some lessons out of the Solarium, Cyberspace Solarium Commission on how to do that in practice. We have these kind of more informal networks, but maybe you have some insight about some of the ways that we've kind of grappled with that in the US.
Yeah, I'll give you a very specific example that maybe others will want to follow suit. We realized that not the Solariums, another project that I'm involved in. We realized that within our critical infrastructure, especially within our utilities, our operational technology, the folks that run the big systems inside of our critical infrastructure, were out of the loop in terms of intelligence sharing and threat sharing. There was a lot of information starting to flow back between those that collect information and intelligence and assess it and analyze it, and to the informational technology folks in our critical infrastructure, right? Those pathways were really starting to generate a lot of goodness on the IT side. But as the threat evolved in cyberspace, focused more and more on OT, on operational technology, we realized those operators were being left out. And so I helped create a program through the Department of Energy where we brought together in our first class 10 of the largest utilities in the country to have a fellowship. They contributed one of their OT operator defenders, and we connected them to the folks inside the U.S. government in the various agencies to share threat data. How do you share it? And it went both ways. And let me tell you, we're now at the tail end of the first year. The folks inside the government, and we're talking all those three-letter agencies, had as many questions for the OT side in these big utilities saying, what are you seeing on your systems? And so, that is at the heart of the goodness of what private-public, can be. And so it's an amazing program that DOE has just re-upped for the next year, and it's expanding out to oil and gas as well. And given the very real threats to oil and gas in Europe, might be something that y'all want to think about. We're thinking about expanding it to bring in Europeans as well.
Might be something worth looking at.
Yeah.
So we are right at time, but I want to give Chelsey a chance to weigh in here because I know that I'm sure within your work you've addressed this topic as well. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to hold you to about a minute or two just because of the time limitations, but please.
No, I'll be very short. Really would just echo what John said in terms of the people, and I think the colleagues John works with on a daily basis. It's about the communities at the political, military, technical level, but then also, within the incident response. NATO also has arrangements with each of the national cyber defense authorities, so dedicated MOUs to try to create that, events every year to bring the best analysts, the best responders together to have a chat. And so I think that's really important. And last but not least, the practical value of it as well. NATO as a platform where we're increasingly looking under ACT's leadership as well on exercise development, on how do we make this more integrated and more practical among people. So nothing further to say. He covered it.
On time and under budget. So I will close because I know we have breakout rooms coming up, but I want to thank all three of our panelists who kind of over the course of this hour have really demonstrated that there's a large amount of agreement at the kind of conceptual level in this space about what some of the issues are we face around intelligence sharing, resilience, public-private partnership, needing to be able to address this constant contact and jostling, wide range of actors potentially in this space. And there's a lot of agreement there. But the reality is we are now at that stage where the devil's in the details and we need to start actually operationalizing and acting on that shared understanding because they will have to put a lot of kinks are going to come up in that process, and we're going to be learning as we go, and that there's a lot of shared value in learning from each other as we go and trying not to reinvent the wheel or reinvent a wheel that is not actually a wheel that doesn't work, that we've maybe tried and discovered that's not the right approach. So really learning and sharing. Thank you all for the panelists, for everyone who is there in Tallinn, for everyone who is there online, for all the event organizers, and for everyone who's come before us to set the stage for today. I will hand it back over to those that are physically in place in the room.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and all the speakers. It was really excellent panel. And now we go back to the breakout room for the final discussion.